On today's episode of the 1012 podcast, the latest comments from Arizona school president on realignment. Jake Schwanitz from DNVR Buffs talks about Colorado. Do fans want to join the Big 12? Plus a little preview of the TCU game. Joe Broback comes on to preview his college football preview magazine. We're going to talk a lot of Big 12, his thoughts on the upcoming season, plus the narrative that's starting to build that you should not buy. Welcome to the 1012, the podcast that covers all 10 teams in the Big 12 Conference, plus BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF. We are the flagship show of the 1012 Network and partners with Sports Drink, your water cooler for all things sports and not sports, a fantastic podcast network in their own right. I'm your host, Philip Slavin. Thank you for joining us this week. Wow, what a week it's been. What a week it is going to be. We are still waiting on the news this week about Big 12 Mexico. We tweeted everything out. You've seen the reports after Big 12 meetings last week in West Virginia. One of the updates coming will be Big 12 Mexico. We're supposed to find out news about that this week. I fully expect that to come out today, Thursday. After this episode's come out, we will tweet about it at 1012 Network when those details come out. It was a pleasure to be able to be on the media call with Brett Yormark after the spring meetings. Get to ask a question about, what are the plans for the championships and expanding the experience that they have had, men's basketball tournament, women's basketball tournament, baseball, having unique foods, having all these cool things going on. I'm excited that they're going to expand that to other championship games. Come on, the women's sports, they need it. Softball deserves it. Soccer deserves it. Let's get it going. Obviously, Big 12 Mexico news is going to be coming out this week, or supposed to. Big 12 refresh. No new name change, no new logo, just some updates. Excited about all of that. Lots of things for the Big 12 to be excited about. Cannot wait for all of it. I want to, before we get going too much further, at the moment, Oklahoma, Florida State, championship series for college softball in a rain delay again for game one. Not sure. It will not be done by the time we finish this one. I will go ahead and stick with the prediction I've been making pretty much all season. Oklahoma will win a third straight national championship. We should know by this weekend. Congratulations to TCU and Texas, two Big 12 teams who advanced to super regionals, the only two teams to advance. TCU, shout out to your fans. Shout out to the Lupton Drinking Club. If you are not aware, that is a fantastic TCU podcast that's all about TCU baseball. But they got on Twitter. Here's the background story. TCU knocking off Arkansas in the regional and will face Indiana State, who was a host. Indiana State should be hosting a super regional this weekend. Instead, TCU will, because there are not enough hotels available, because Indiana State hosts the Special Olympics Indiana. The event's going on this summer. The one in Arkansas is actually hosted here where I live. Well, Indiana State hosts the Special Olympics, so they will not be able to host the Super Regional. It'll go to TCU. As a sign of support, TCU fans, started by the Lupton Drinking Club, which is a fantastic podcast, encourage TCU fans to make donations to the Indiana Special Olympics. And we put our donation in. Very excited, very happy to have done so. If you haven't yet, you still can. They have raised more than $25,000 this week already for Special Olympics Indiana, which is incredible. Absolutely incredible. And shout out to Indiana State for saying, look, we would love to, but we can't. This is too important. We would love to host a super regional, the first time we'd ever be able to do so, but we're going to go to Fort Worth because hosting this event is too important to us. And that is incredible. Props to Indiana State. You have a fan of the 1012 podcast, the 1012 Network forever. As long as you're not playing a Big 12 team, we're rooting for you. We absolutely are, except for this weekend. Like, rooting for you in general, but I want TCU to get to Omaha. That would be nice. So shout out to Lupton Drinking Club for getting that going. I want to say this real quick. A couple things about realignment. Obviously, that's big. The big story. The Colorado smoke is thicker than ever. Two things I want to talk about. First of all, let me say this. I don't cheer for the demise of another conference. I've said this many times. I don't care what Pac-12 fans said when OU and Texas were announced to be leaving the Big 12. I don't care what anyone else has done to Big 12 fans. Do unto others how you would want done unto you, not do unto others how they have done unto you. Very, big difference. It's about personal responsibility. So I don't want the demise of any other conference to occur. I won't be happy if the Pac-12, Pac-10, or ACC folds. I don't want to see that happen to the Washington States and Oregon States and Boston colleges of the world. I don't want to see happen to them what the remaining 8 feared would happen to them when it was now OU and Texas were leaving the Big 12. I don't care what those fan bases said. I don't care what they did. That said, stealing a team for another Power 5 conference, something the Big 12 has had done to them multiple times now, puts the Big 12 in a seat that it's not been in since the conference went from the Big 8 to the Big 12. We've seen Colorado, Nebraska, Texas A&M, Missouri get poached. We're seeing Oklahoma and Texas get poached. 2 times everyone's like, well, the Big 12's doomed. It's the end of the Big 12, and it has survived like a cockroach at the end of days. Getting a team from the Pac-12 to leave that Power 5 conference and join the Big 12 would be an incredible feat. That is a big deal because it is a Power 5 team from a Power 5 conference coming to the Big 12. I say all of that because I want to do this. There is a narrative that is already being built up because the smoke is so thick for Colorado that everyone at this point just thinks they're going to come. There is a narrative that is building. That is bull. Do not buy it. Do not buy it's not a big deal if Colorado leaves the Pac-12, Pac-10. They'll just go grab San Diego State. Same diff. You're getting the worst team and the worst program in the Pac-12. We'll go get San Diego State. Same thing. Nope. It's a G5 school. It's a G5 school. That's like saying Iowa State's leaving the Big 12, but it's okay. We got Cincinnati. No. Hey, you know what? West Virginia left, but that's all right. We got UCF coming in. No. It's not the same thing. Replacing a Power 5 with a G5 is not the same. I don't care what level of success Colorado has had in the Pac-12. It ain't the same. Don't buy the narrative. It's already getting pumped. It's absolutely nonsense. One thing you should be buying are hats from Last Stand Hats. Very excited to have them here as a sponsor of the 1012 podcast. If you are a fan of wearing some pretty cool and unique ball caps, which I used to wear hats. I wasn't a big hat guy growing up. I have become one, and I, like my home field apparel shirts, like to get a variety of different things. So if you're a fan of Texas, Texas Tech, TCU, or Oklahoma State, schools in the Big 12 that Last Stand Hats has available, then you need to go to laststandhats.com. Go check out their fantastic hat collection that they have right now available. They just put out their Texas Super Regional hat. It's a horns up hand gesture. It's super cool. It's very unique. It's very neat. Go check it out at laststandhats.com. Use the promo code NETWORK12 for 10% off your order. Go shop. They got a lot of other things too. That promo code works on everything there at the site. But we're talking hats because that's why I'm excited about the most to work with them on. Very unique things. I'm not kidding. If you're a Texas Tech fan, the Texas Tech golf hat, it is superb. Go check it out. Go check it out now. laststandhats.com, Network12, 10% off your order. You need a hat this summer? Get ready for football season. That's where you want to shop. Now, the other realignment story we're going to talk about. Arizona president was in D.C. And talked to media on Wednesday and had a lot. Robert Robbins, Arizona president, meeting with media in D.C., says he is unaware of any agreement among Pac-12 schools as far as a grant of rights. There won't be one until, quote, we see a deal. We have not seen a deal. That is, of course, the grant of rights that John Calzano said that all these schools have verbally agreed to, like it was some big breaking news story. Jason Shear, who covers Arizona for 247's, like we've all known about this for weeks. It's not a big deal because it's a non-story. Because it doesn't matter if you have a verbal agreement about a grant of rights when there's not a TV deal. There's not a TV deal. So, hey, if we get a TV deal we like, we're happy to sign a grant of rights. Well, that's a big story. It's a big deal. No, it's pretty much par for the course. It's what we've known. The Pac-12 schools would prefer to make more money than the Big 12 and the ACC and thus be able to stay together as a conference. And if that happens, then they will. And if that does not happen, we'll see. Would Arizona be interested in moving conferences? Robert Robbins, quote, depends on what our financial deal is. Now, he did say my prediction is that we are going to stay together. That's good. That's a good thing if you're a Pac-12 fan who wants the conference to hold together. But when you say things like depends on what our financial deal is, we have not seen a deal. And then my favorite one is this. Quote, we are not going to get a Big Ten deal. We're not going to get an SEC deal. But if we finish third in the sweepstakes, I've never thought that winning the bronze medal was a great aspirational goal, but if we win a bronze medal, I think we'd all declare victory. If they have the third best TV contract, then yeah, they're going to stay together, and the Pac-12 and Pac-12 fans are going to smear it in everyone's face, and they should. He did mention that we've seen kind of projections and what our value is, and what we think we should get because of how valuable we are. Problem is, you're only as valuable as what someone's willing to pay for you. And up to this point, ain't no one been willing to pay what they think they should be paid. From Robin's quote, my prediction is we're all going to stay together as a Pac-12. There's 10 of us right now. I'm hopeful that the deal is going to be good enough to keep us together. I think that's the best thing for our students and alumni. That's what we're hoping for. Wrap it on this. We've said it, we've said it, we've said it, we've said it, we've said it. All 10 teams would rather stay together and get a deal that makes it easy to do so. We ain't seen that deal yet. He did also note that, quote, Arizona and Arizona State do not have to do the same thing, but that he and President Crow are very, very tight. I think it'd be unlikely we'd split up. Cool. But that he does have the autonomy to move without Arizona State. It's a good note, since Arizona is the other school that has had the most smoke around it regarding a leave for the Big 12. The next few weeks, I keep telling you, July 1 feels like that deadline. That feels like the deadline. If something's going to happen, if Colorado, Arizona, anybody's going to come to the Big 12, that feels like the deadline. And maybe it's not. Maybe that's superficial. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe they could still join the Big 12 this summer of 2024 if they don't decide to do anything until October. But it feels like July 1 is the deadline. Before July 1 is when we saw the USC-UCLA announcement. I think it's a similar timeline. All right. 2 great guests. We're going to talk a little more Colorado. Jake Schwanitz from DNVR Buffs. And then our good friend, great friend, fantastic friend, Joe Broback put out his college football preview magazine. We're going to go over it. You'll find a link to it in the show notes. You can also find the link to 1012network.com where you can find every show in the network. Check them all out. Everyone's doing an incredible job. Give them hell BYU, Scott and Holman, Rock Chalk Podcast, Raspy Voice Kids, Feels Like 45. Everybody's doing an incredible job. And we're working on more shows. I am. We're going to take a break here soon so that I can do some of that work. In the meantime, though, great episode, 2 great guests. Let's get to it. If you haven't heard, maybe you just woke up from a coma, you've been living in a cave for a while. There's a lot of hullabaloo this summer about a Pac-12, whether they'll get a TV deal signed in time, whether or not Colorado, former Big 8, Big 12 member, will come back to the Big 12. And while all of that's very interesting, I'm really curious to hear kind of how fans in Colorado are thinking and feeling about this potential news, other than the fact that they've got Deion Sanders. So very excited to have Jake Schwanitz of DNVR Buffs joining us. Jake, welcome to the 1012, sir.
Thanks, Philip, man. It's good to be here. Lots of stuff going on, man. College football is a wild business, isn't it?
Business is the right term. I think that I think we've all kind of come around to that reality that it is, if it hasn't sunk in yet for you folks, it should real soon. No one knows anything with maybe the exception of like 4 people. Because as we all know, when it comes to conference realignment, this is a decision made by presidents, not ADs, not coaches, not fans, not players, not boosters, school presidents. So there is a handful of people who actually know what's going on with the Pac-12 deal. The latest talk from Arizona's president today was that, they don't have a deal yet. They haven't seen a final deal. So obviously no one really knows what's going to happen, but I am curious from your perspective, kind of what's the vibe there in Denver and in Boulder with all of this news happening?
It's kind of just throwing gasoline on a fire, really. We go back a year ago and fans were still upset about the Pac-12 move. They've been clamoring to get out of the Pac basically since USC and UCLA announced they were leaving to the Big Ten. So this is something fans have been wanting for a while, and it looks like we're trending in that direction, obviously. It's just been fascinating to watch the media, how these insiders kind of report this news, because obviously there's one side who's very dug in on the Big 12 side and another side very dug in on the Pac-12 side, and they're just kind of slinging mud at each other. It's really hard to really, gauge what is actually being noted as truth, guess. But from what I've been able to gather and what I would infer, it feels like the Big 12 is going to be the move here for Colorado. Just judging, we haven't heard from President Solomon yet, but judging from Rick George's comments about a week or two ago, it's absolutely a possibility. It's not something that is just being thrown around in the media or talked about in circles of fans. I think this is a real thing, and Colorado, I think, is just keeping their cards close to their vest and waiting to see exactly what comes down the pipeline from the Pac-12. And if not, I think they're more than willing. It will be quick to make the move to the Big 12.
This is the program that has had the most smoke around it as far as leaving. To some extent, it's the only program or school that feels like no matter what happens with the deal, unless they are going to make more in the Pac-10, Pac-12 than they would in the Big 12, that might just go ahead and pull the trigger no matter what anybody else does. That's why we're already seeing the narratives of, if Colorado leaves, Pac-12 will be fine. We'll just grab San Diego State. Won't make any difference. That's nonsense, of course, but that's fine. Whatever narratives need to start being established can be established. But from what you kind of hinted at, it does feel like Colorado fans, while there's lots going on, would lean towards returning back to the Big 12, at least those in and around the Denver and Boulder area.
Absolutely. They're all on board. I mean, we already know the history. This team, Colorado University, was in the Big 8, Big 12 for a long, long time. Their heyday as a program. And it was the Pac-12 it's just interesting. We go back 10 years ago, it was the Big 12 who had looked on the verge of collapse. And now it's the Pac-12 at this point. Fans have been clamoring for this, though. I'll tell you that if Colorado does make the jump, I think that there's going to be a lot more cheers than, tears out here in Colorado.
So that is interesting. I mean, obviously they made the move before because it felt like the Big 12 was falling apart. And of course, there's such a large alumni base for Colorado out on the West Coast. You've got a lot of the big money boosters are out there. And their belief at the time was they would have a better time recruiting and building their program up by leaning into that alumni base on the West Coast. From your perspective, forget whether they come back or not. Has the move benefited Colorado? Obviously not from a record standpoint, but has it benefited them in the way that they thought that it would when they initially made the move?
Oh man, that's a hard question. I'd say probably not. This university really before December when they hired Deion Sanders, it was a lot of just things going wrong. The football team was bad. They couldn't recruit. Fans were upset at the level that they were recruiting at, upset at how they were performing on the field. Even basketball had a down year last year. There was just not a lot of momentum really until the Deion Coach Prime Sanders rumors started late November and December. So yeah, I mean, it probably didn't work out as best in the best case scenario for Colorado and just, I guess, the Pac-12 in general the last 10 years. But it's tough to say. I mean, without Nebraska in the Big 12, when they left to the Big 10 as well, you lose your main rivalry, your main dance partner, really. And Colorado's just kind of in limbo, really. You don't really have a rival in the Pac-12. You're closer to a lot of these schools, I guess, than you would be in the Big 12, especially, down the line as, expansion happened, West Virginia's and all those came in. But it's, I don't know. I think you're really splitting hairs, but I would lean no, that it hasn't really worked out as intended.
From that standpoint, I would say even if it's been a net neutral, it's not been as good as they had hoped it would be. You mentioned Deion. I don't know how anybody doesn't know that Deion Sanders is the head coach of Colorado. The spring game, a sellout. This is a spring game that is like, hey, we got 100 people. Congrats. Now Deion Sanders is selling the entire spring game out. And it's setting up for honestly, one of the biggest, or at least the most talked about week 1 games of the season coming up. Colorado making a trip to Fort Worth, going to face off with TCU in year 1. I mean, again, I'm not going to say it's the biggest game of week 1 because it's hard to know with TCU and Colorado and it's the first game of the Deion Sanders era. No one's going to come in and expect, especially with all the turnover, that it's going to be out of the gate lightning. But you've got the Deion Sanders angle. You've got TCU coming off a national championship berth. It's a big storyline week 1 game. We know the news about Deion Sanders completely and totally overhauled this roster. I mean, at this point, I think they had at least 80% of last year's roster is gone. And I think I'm underdoing that number because I'm trying to not overdo it. Where do you feel like this program is at right now?
I mean, it's on the up. It's definitely probably the most momentum this program has had since 2016, the season that we call the rise out here, when they won then the Pac-12 South, and had a trip to the championship game. It's been a lot of hard years since then. So, I mean, the bar is really, really low for them to clear, but the momentum is undeniable. I mean, obviously, they brought in a ton of transfers, they've been recruiting pretty well. Now you kind of have this Big 12 stuff going where, back in, what was it, October, when the Big 12 deal originally came down, it was kind of panic, because Colorado was obviously really down in football. Basketball wasn't really too hyped. So, they were in limbo. No one really knows what they're going to do. But at this point, man, if you get Deion Sanders in the Big 12, he can recruit Texas again. You can recruit Florida now with UCF there, which is insane. The momentum is probably as good as it's been since that 2016 season. And the fans have been, holding on to that too. They're really excited. And you mentioned the spring game. It doesn't take much to get, all of Buff Nation out there and just in the streets and excited and partying at this point. I mean, you just mentioned Coach Prime and they're already glowing in the face. So probably the best this program has been since that 2016 season. But, once we start the games, that's when we find out for sure, right?
I am curious kind of your expectations for that week one game. It's week one. Again, roster overhaul. I've heard a number of people kind of point out, and I think this is quite accurate. With transfers, if you get a 50% success rate of half the transfers come in, you've had a very successful transfer class, because you just don't know, especially if you've got people coming up from a lower level to a P5 level. It's so drastically different. But I mean, the season as a whole versus week one's going to be tough. But I mean, what do you feel like, other than just the excitement of Deion Sanders being on the sideline in his first game? What would make Colorado fans happy in game one?
After what we saw last year in terms of the quarterback play and just offensive ineptitude, just seeing them move the ball, I think, would really make them excited. Watching Shador be able to drop a few passes in the bucket, maybe hit a big one. I think that's enough really to just get them excited about this season and excited about where they're headed. I haven't checked the line in a few weeks. I know it's been around 20 points. To me, that feels too high. I mean, TCU lost a lot too. There's just so many unknowns in this game that it's really impossible, I think, to try and handicap it. And having a 20-point spread, I feel like, is kind of outrageous given the circumstances for both teams. But I mean, Travis is going to be out there making plays. I think just seeing these guys making plays is really going to be what the fan base is looking forward to in week one. In terms of expectations, though, it's so hard to say. I'd expect them to be, just in general, a better football team. Again, not a high bar to clear from last year, so who knows exactly what that looks like. But I feel confident in saying that they will be better.
All right. It is June 7th as we are recording this. Last year, it was right before July 1st, right at the end of June, when the news that USC and UCLA were headed for the Big Ten came out. That July 1 date feels kind of like if the move's going to happen, it's going to have to be by that time. So let's look ahead. I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball here. We're sitting here on July 1st, July 4th weekend, having ourselves a hot dog and a drink and watching the fireworks go off. Is Colorado in their last season of the big Pac-12, or are they buckled in for another 4 to 5 year run out there out west?
I think they're jumping. I think they're going to the Big 12. I think they're ready to go in on what Yormack is, building with this conference, trying to lean into basketball. CU's got great momentum in basketball right now with Cody Williams coming in, top recruit in the country. As I mentioned, you basically bring Deion Sanders back into these hotbeds where he's at his most famous, really, in Texas and in Florida, just from his playing career and where he's from in Florida. I think that's where they end up going, and I think that's where Colorado ultimately wants to be. I think they want to go back to the Big 12.
I'm happy to have him. Boulder is an awesome town. Adding Boulder back as a Big 12 city is not a bad thing. And I think Big 12 fans are kind of split. I mean, I think there's still some. Look, played forever in the Elite Eight or the Big 8 and the Big 12. So there's plenty of still just like, I remember them. They were terrible. But you know what?
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be a lot of fun. And it's always good to poach a team from another Power 5 conference. Jake, I really appreciate your time today, man. For everybody who wants to learn more about Colorado and Deion Sanders and kind of get excited for this coming season, because I think it's been a very long time before anyone was excited heading into a Colorado Buffalo football season. Where can they check out all the work you do covering the Buffs?
Yeah, so you can find me at Jake DNVR on Twitter. You can find the show Apple Podcast, Spotify. We also stream on YouTube. Just search DNVR Buffs, and you'll find us right there.
Jake, appreciate your time, man. I enjoy the off season. It's the most exciting off season for Colorado in a long time, and I don't mean that as something like tongue in cheek. Like, it's just there's a lot to be excited about. So enjoy it, man. Soak it all in.
Appreciate it, man. You do the same, Philip. Thanks for having me on, bro.
I'm Sam, and I co-host the Scott and Holm podcast, the known universe's first Houston Cougar sports podcast. Every week, even during the offseason, my co-host Dustin and I come on and talk everything current as it relates to the Cougs, and every so often, we'll bring on UH luminaries like Carl Lewis, Kellen Sampson, and a number of other fantastic Cougar voices. And as proud members of the 1012 network, we also find the time to talk about our future conference and future opponents in the Big 12 as well. If all of that sounds even a little bit interesting to you, we would love it if you subscribe to the Scott Holm podcast on Apple, Spotify, and everywhere else you put podcasts in your ears. That's podcast spelled P-A-W-D cast, because the two of us hosting the show are nothing if not big dorks. So thank you, and go Cougs.
College football season will be here before you know it. It is June. It is the doldrums. But this is the time of the year when the preview magazines start coming out. Well, Athlon already put theirs out. Phil Steele will be out soon. Lots of them are popping up. One of our favorites here at the 1012 podcast is, of course, the College Football Preview magazine that our good friend Joe Broback puts out every year. It is free. It won't cost you a nickel. You can download this thing. It's massive. It looks incredible. I'm thrilled that it's out. And so I'm thrilled to have our good friend Joe back on the show to talk about his preview magazine, talk a little Big 12 football. Joe, welcome back, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. 4 years in a row now. I think it's pretty good. I'm excited to be back.
Absolutely. And it won't be your only appearance. We always try and get you on a couple times during the summer. It's always fun to shoot the breeze with you, sir. Look, this thing just dropped on Wednesday. So if anyone is not, you're going to want to get it downloaded. The link will be in the show's bio or in the show notes. We'll make sure it's on our Twitter account. You can find it on Instagram. And of course, we'll let you know more about where to find it from Joe here coming up a little bit. But let's just dive in. It is a big thing. It's beautiful. There's no Big 12 player on the cover, so I'm gonna knock you there. Although UTSA is there, so I'll let it slide. Okay, that's like our adopted, team over there from the G5. I want to start with this. You've got your All-American team, both on offense and defense. Excuse me. And you've got a Big 12 player on both. So I have to start off by asking you this. You've got Kansas State offensive lineman Cooper Beebe on your All-American offense, and you've got Cincinnati defensive lineman Dante Corleone on your All-American defense. So the first question here is, are those two players to you the two best players in the Big 12 this year? Or is it just those are the spots they were able to fill?
No, I think that when you're looking at All-American teams, it's tough because when you look at certain positions, like Xavier Worthy's probably a good example. If Xavier Worthy has the season that I think he can have, assuming that he figures out how to not drop passes and Quinn Ewers figures out how to not overthrow him somehow, like he'll be an All-American. And when you look at who he's competing against, Marvin Harrison Jr., Johnny Wilson, and Romeo Dunze, those are three good guys. It doesn't mean that Xavier Worthy is not as good as Cooper Beebe or Dante Corleone. It means that there's certain positions that are better than others. Now I think there's a lot of Quinn Ewers is another one that he's going against Caleb Williams and Drake May. Like, there's not a lot of people that are going to put him right now above either of those two. Now, if this team has the season that they're capable of, then that's going to happen, because you look at Quinshon Judkins is a perfect example. Nobody knew who he was because he was an incoming freshman. He was not an All-American at this time last year. And then you have an incredible season, and he's better than some of those guys that were listed as All-American. So it kind of depends on the season that you're having, the position that you're going against. I think that the Big 12 has a lot of talent that could be considered in this list. It's just that there's a lot of guys at the top especially at the skill positions offensively. Like even Jatavian Sanders too. I mean, this is really Texas heavy. I apologize, but Brock Bowers is obviously the best tight end in college football. But I think Jatavian Sanders could have a huge year. I really like the speed at which he plays. I think that his effort is something that we don't talk about enough. He works really hard at what he does, and you're going to be in a system that's going to give you opportunities to catch football and make plays. So there's a lot of guys that could show up. It's just not a matter of what position you play and who else is really good at that position as well.
So let's pull up. You've got your team rankings heading into the season for the Big 12. Let's talk a little bit more Texas since we've already talked some. Let's keep that train going. You've got Texas number one. That's not surprising. Like, that seems to be the consensus this offseason. Like, I'll tell you right now, when we fill out our poll, I will have Texas number one unless some crazy thing happens between now and that time, because it does feel like they've been building toward this. You look at last season, the number of games they had that were one-score games that they lost to go 8-4. Like, it does feel like if you look at year one to last year to where the growth should be, given how young that roster was last year, and some of the injuries that derailed them, the development of Quinn Ewers, who should have been a true freshman last year, but even though he went out of high school a year early, I think people are, and rightfully so, going to need to see it to believe it with Texas, because we've had so many off seasons of like, Texas is back, preseason top 25. This is it. We had one good season out of Tom Herman where they made it to the Big 12 title game, and then from there, which is Tom Herman. Like, why should fans believe that this is the year for Texas? Help us try and set some of our justifiable skepticism aside.
Well, that's a question every year, right? We make a joke that Texas is back, and then they just somehow find a way to struggle. And I don't know. It's just that you recruit at a level as high as Texas has for so long, even with Tom Herman. Like, they've been recruiting really well. It's just a matter of putting it together. Now, I think the thing we talk about in college football, and Bud Elliott's even said it to this from Cover 3, he said that a lot of college coaches who are good, they're really good at recruiting. They're not necessarily good coaches in terms of getting the talent to play better, and that's why they're in college and not in the NFL. And I think there is some truth to that. It's just that now I think that Herman was a better G5 coach, honestly, and I'm really excited to see what he does at FAU. Because I think that he builds a culture when it's guys that are kind of backs against the wall underdogs. Whereas now Texas, none of these guys are underdogs, despite what Bryce Young might tell you. You're looking at, or even the Georgia Bulldogs that predicted to be 7-5, which is really unfortunate. But these aren't underdogs. These are the best of the best, and these are guys that everybody wanted. And getting them to play at a different level requires a special kind of coach. And I think that Sark, his time in Alabama helped him with so many things. And I think that he learned this is what it's like to be around top 5, top 10 talent. And this is how you motivate them. Like, all these guys want to get to the NFL, and you have a lot of players that want to do that. And I think Sark, with not only an offense that kids love to play in, I think that you got a guy who knows how to motivate these kids. Now, there are some things we talked about earlier. Quinn Ewers and Xavier Worthy have to figure their errors out from last year. Quinn, obviously, you want him to stay healthy. And the Alabama game is the one that everyone circles. And I think that people are going to lose their minds if they go into Tuscaloosa and find a way to win that game. I just think that they have a well-rounded team. They're not relying on one position to be as good or better than most of the conference. You look at a couple years ago, this defensive line was talked about by everybody, and that was like the unit that we all harped on. It was, this defensive line is going to be so good, and it's like, okay, well, what about the linebackers in the secondary? Like, they have to play too. And I think that this is the first year I felt that you have a ton of talent that can be well-rounded and play together. And we talked about Ewers and Worthy. You have Adonai Mitchell coming in from Georgia. You have Jordan Whittington back. You have Isaiah Nair coming back from injury, former Wyoming transfer. And then Jonte Cooks, the freshman, was cooking people. I think that offense is even more explosive than it was last year. And now you got to keep Ewers in. But I think that you're looking at a team that, even when you lose your top player in Bijan Robinson, you have a well-rounded unit that's going to be better as a whole. And that's going to be the biggest thing. You can't rely on one or two guys to win you football games. You have to have a well-rounded, and that's going to apply when they go to the SEC too. You're going into a conference that is loaded from top to bottom. Okay, maybe not bottom Vanderbilt, although they were better last year, but you're in a there's more parity in that conference. So that's going to require you to be better on both sides of the ball overall, not just at one or two positions. So I think that for me, Texas just has a talent level that's finally playing up to its talent level, I think they had in the past years, they had 5 stars playing like 3 stars. And now you have 4 and 5-star kids playing like the stars that they had coming out of high school.
So you have Texas as your kind of preseason one. Like I said, not too surprising. You have them as your best team in the conference. Let me run down the rest of your top 4 of your 14 rankings. Oklahoma at 2. We'll get to that in a second. TCU at 3. Kansas State at 4. Texas Tech 5. Oklahoma State 6. Followed by UCF, Kansas, Baylor, BYU to round out the top 10. Bottom 4, Iowa State, Houston, Cincinnati, and West Virginia. The conversation I want to keep going this offseason, I think people are finally starting to have about this kind of new look Big 12, where Oklahoma isn't dominating the conference, and now we've got 4 new teams coming in, and Oklahoma and Texas are leaving, is this is a conference. And I think this story should have been talked about more, and we should have figured it out when a new team made the Big 12 championship game since it came back every year, is that this is a conference about cycles. And teams are going to get to the conference championship game on their up cycles. This is, there's not going to be a Bama, a Georgia, an Ohio State, a Michigan where we're just reloading. We've backfilled with so much talent that we can just continue and expect to be the best of the best every single year. Teams have to hit it on the up cycle. And so for the Big 12, like we've got Oklahoma at 2, TCU and Kansas State, who both made the Big 12 title game last year at 3 and 4. And then you kind of have everybody else. And so I look at this and I'm curious, how do you evaluate the Big 12, or how difficult is it to evaluate and make predictions for a conference where you almost have to throw a lot of what happened last year out the window? And I know you have to do that for everybody, but this is a conference where you don't have stalwarts at the top now, where you have to evaluate almost from scratch every year because you're dealing with up cycles for teams, and you have to kind of figure out which ones are at that year where the seniors are there, the starters are there, and can they hit?
Yeah, and I think I'll add to, you look at, I think the cycles is the perfect way to explain it. And I think that every team has those cycles. Even Georgia and Alabama, like Georgia is very much obviously in an up cycle right now. I'd say Alabama is in a down cycle, but it's just that Alabama's down cycle means they're like 3rd or 4th best team in the SEC and still a top 25 team, where Oklahoma's down cycle is going 500. So like each team has ups and downs. It's just a matter of like, I mean, even before Georgia was up here, like they were still in the SEC championship game. They were still competing to win a national championship. It's just that they, for whatever reason, couldn't get, it's kind of like Texas. Like they were bringing in good recruiting classes. Mark Richt was doing a good job. It's just that he couldn't get it done on the field. And that's just is what it is. Now, in the Big 12, it's tough enough. I think even without these 4 teams coming in, to figure out, like, is Texas and Oklahoma, are they going to be better than they were last year? I think that they were purely based off the talent they have returning and the fact that it was Brent Venables' first year. Now, with UCF, I think the hardest thing was for UCF, BYU, Houston, and Cincinnati is I don't know how anyone can justify putting them above 6th or 7th, just because we don't know how they're going to handle a full year of Power 5 competition. Now, it's one thing to beat Auburn in the Peach Bowl when you played AAC competition. Now, that's not a knock on the AAC, because to me, the AAC is better than a lot of people give credit, but playing Baylor is not the same as playing ECU in the middle of the season. Playing Iowa State is not the same as playing one of those other teams that are going to give you playing a Tulane, playing Tulsa. Like Tulsa might be a good analogy there, just because the atmosphere is so different. Like it's a different level of competition. And yes, these teams are very good, and I'm high on UCF and what they can do this year. But honestly, like anybody that says, "Oh yeah, it's easy to predict where these teams are going," I don't think that's true. I think that there's so many different factors going in it. You also throw in the fact that Texas and Oklahoma are going to be gone next year, and that creates another wrinkle that we're going to have to figure out. But you're looking at teams that were in the AAC, are used to playing AAC competition, and then giving it their best against a Power 5 team. You're going to have to do that every single week. You're going to have to play Oklahoma State, and then you travel to TCU, and then you have to go to Manhattan and play Kansas State. Like it's different to do that because the recruiting level is different, and the talent level that you face is also different. So evaluating these teams maybe more from like 6 or 7 all the way down is where things get interesting, because I think that the top 4 or 5 are pretty much still going to be the top 4 or 5. It's just how do these new teams, and one of them will probably surprise us. They will probably be better, then we expect probably not Houston or Cincinnati, if I'm being honest, but maybe I'm wrong. But that's going to be interesting to see because it's really hard to guess where these teams are going to go. And you almost kind of have to get that first set of data points to actually evaluate what's going on.
Yeah, where it's going to be interesting to me when it comes to the 4 newcomers is what is the back half of the schedule going to be like for them? Yes, you've had 2 years to prepare for this. The transfer portal makes getting talent easier, and you've had more time to prepare than, say, TCU and West Virginia when they came to the Big 12, or Utah when they went to Pac-12, and so on and so forth. So it's a very different situation. But you haven't been recruiting and don't have that depth of talent that the other Big 12 schools do. And so how do you handle the back half of the schedule when you're not used to playing a Power 5 team every single week in a Big 12 where I've had this conversation with multiple people. We had our good friend Kelly Ford on. Like, the bottom of the Big 12 is frankly better than the bottom of every other Power 5 conference. And so you don't have Kansas isn't the game off anymore. And West Virginia is not going to be very good, but we're still talking about a probably top 75 college football program, whereas the ACC's got teams that are worse. The Big Ten's going to have teams that are worse. The Pac-12 is probably going to have teams that are worse. Like, yes, West Virginia, you might say, is the worst team in the Big 12, but it's still better than a lot of other Power 5 teams. And so you're not getting to have a quote-unquote week off, right? And so it is interesting to see for them how they're going to handle going in that schedule by the last month of the season and how they're able to handle that. You've got Oklahoma too. I think a lot of people kind of do at this point, and that's fine given what they have on the roster. I think the schedule, the Big 12 did Oklahoma a giant, massive favor. I don't understand why they did. I get why they did, but also it's potentially going to come back and bite them. But I still think Oklahoma has a lot of questions. Where it's interesting to me is TCU at 3 and Kansas State at 4. You've got TCU one spot ahead of Kansas State. That's not like some demonstratively different thing. But I'm curious about the TCU versus Kansas State argument here. The two teams that made it to the Big 12 title game last year, outside of Oklahoma making it and winning it every year, we don't see repeat teams. How do you kind of decide TCU versus Kansas State? Both teams lost a lot of important pieces. Both bring some things back. I could argue what Kansas State brings back, especially with Will Howard at quarterback, an established quarterback who started multiple games. Basically, their top 8 offensive linemen. Why TCU over Kansas State? What to you gives the Horned Frogs the edge over the Wildcats?
It's hard when people look at rankings, they see a number and they're just like, well, there's obviously a big difference between TCU and Kansas State. And honestly, I get that. But at the same time, the difference between TCU and Kansas State is so minimal that if you make an argument, say Kansas State's better than TCU, I'm not going to be a troll and be like, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Kansas State won the Big 12 for a reason. Now, I think that I just look at what TCU has coming back. I think that they have a majority of their defensive playmakers back that will continue doing what they did last year. And you look at the offense, I trust that offense will be ready to go quicker than Kansas State's. And it's not anything to do with, Chandler Morris is technically a new starter, although I think a lot of people forget that he was the starter going into the Colorado game in the Colorado game before he got hurt. And that's a whole, what if Chandler Morris doesn't get hurt? Does TCU go to the playoff? That's a fun thing to go down. That rabbit hole would be fun to go down, but we obviously don't know. So something happened in practice where Chandler Morris was clearly better. And Sonny Dykes' system is just proven to work outside of if you're looking at, Cal and just pretty much wipe that from the record. But his time is at SMU and now at TCU, this offense puts up points. They know how to score. They know how to get things going quicker or sooner rather than later. And I think that Kansas State is, I think the one thing that I would say is that a lot of their important pieces on both sides of the ball are gone. And yeah, they do return some really exciting pieces. I'm excited to see what even the receivers like Phillip Brooks will take on a bigger role. You get the Iowa kid that I'm blanking on now, Keegan Johnson, and even RJ Garcia had the big catch in the Big 12 championship game. Those are guys who are relatively unproven. They have good experience, but in terms of stepping up into a big role that a guy like Malik Knowles played for so long, we haven't seen that from them. And Will Howard, yes, I think Will Howard had better moments than people expected, but I think now we maybe are overcompensating a little bit, where we're making him into something that maybe he's not. I really like his talent level, but I'm kind of in that camp of let's wait and see. Also, Deuce Vaughn is gone. And it honestly would be insulting if people were like, oh, we're fine without Deuce Vaughn. Like, yes, your running backs are taller and bigger than Deuce Vaughn, but like that dude was amazing. He, he was one of the more exciting players in college football at 5'5". Like that's unheard of to play at Power Five level at his size. And even you saw the game against Alabama, he was running away from 4 and 5 star guys. Like this dude that no one's heard of, which is the reason why I love Kansas State, is they find those guys. It's the same thing that Kleiman did at NDSU. You find the players that nobody wants and you turn them into stars. And that's incredible. Now, I will say that DJ Giddens and Trayshawn Ward are going to be really good, but I haven't seen the ability to break off big plays like Vaughn did. Those are the questions that I have. And then on defense, you have Khalid Duke back and Daniel Green. I'm really high on both of those two, but you lose a bit of talent as well on that side of the ball where you haven't seen those guys consistently. I mean, you lost the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. So it's not like you're just going to automatically find that other guy. Like you can project all you want, but in the end, these guys had to take on different roles. And some of them were, more of a support cast. And now you have to be the guy. And I think Kansas State has more guys that I'm unsure of if they can take that next step. Whereas TCU, they don't really need, like Chandler Morris doesn't need to be this all-American quarterback. I mean, Max Duggan wasn't an all-American quarterback either, but he was really good. And I think that this system allows Chandler Morris more mistakes than Will Howard does just because of the speed and pace. And you're going to get so many more possessions and chances to score. So I give TCU a slight nod just because I feel like they're in better shape right now. This is not necessarily, I do more my projections too of, they're not even really projections. I just look at them. Where are you right now? Not necessarily like, is Kansas State going to be good at the end of the year? Because the answer is going to be yes. But right now, what are my concerns versus what do they have returning? Whereas a lot of people, I think, look at, oh, well, Kansas State is going to be good. They're better than TCU. I look at it right now where you're at and then kind of evaluate from there.
Yeah, I definitely feel like the pieces, I'm more concerned with the pieces that Kansas State lost to some extent than the TCU pieces that they lost. Like, I feel like I think having them right next to each other is the right move to make. Because look, Deuce Vaughn was a freaking like Swiss Army knife. It's so hard to replace that. I do think they've done a decent job in the transfer portal doing that. I mean, look, and you have, it's not a round robin anymore. Everyone's not playing the same schedule. I mean, we had K Ford on, and he ranked their schedules at TCU and Kansas State like 8th and 9th. So, like, it's really picking nits here to decide which one you like better. And so I think seeing which one has the better kind of bounce back year after last year, because what we've seen more often than not from, again, set Oklahoma aside, the teams that made the Big 12 title game is the follow-up year was disappointing. Everyone would just pick whoever's there as the preseason number 2, and preseason number 2 never got to the Big 12 title game. It was preseason number 5, 6, 7, 8 in the Big 12 poll. And so that leads me to the next question of, look, Texas Tech's hype train is full steam ahead. Everybody is on board the Sonny Dykes train. Everybody's ready to pick them as the dark horse team for this year. And my thing with them is this. I get it. I understand why they're the dark horse. I still think they're a year away from where I feel like I'm going to be all on board with this is the team that could be the surprise in the Big 12 title game. And I don't feel as confident about them making that jump this year as I did Kansas State doing it last year. So you've got Texas Tech at 5th behind the 2 favorites in Texas, Oklahoma, the 2, defending Big 12 title game teams in TCU and Kansas State. Is year 2 the year for Joey McGuire, or is this just kind of the easiest dark horse to pick at this point because of so many questions with so many other teams?
I think a lot of people pick who has, outside of maybe like the top teams in college football, it's who has an exciting offense and a lot of returning production. Because I think the casual fan is just like, who's the quarterback, who's next to him in the backfield, and then who are the wide receivers. And Texas Tech kind of fits that mold. They fit we have really talented quarterbacks. Our wide receivers are going to be nuts. And Taj Brooks is really good out of the backfield too, really explosive. So I think the biggest thing is we just have to see. Okay, now here's the other thing: is it Tyler Shuck or what? Have we changed the name again this year? Like, well, I don't know
It's Shuck.
how to
It's
pronounce his
pronounced
name.
Shuck.
It's still Shuck.
It's spelled
Okay, some people had it.
Shough, but it is pronounced
Yeah,
Shuck.
and I feel like every year we go back and forth, and I was under the impression that it was Shuck. But anyways, he has not played a full season in his career. I think that when you look at his like games played, it goes like 8-3, 8-3, or something like that. Like it basically just flips between 8 and then whatever the smaller number is. And this year, I think he's projected, or he technically is on pace, if you go with that trend, to play 3 games. So I don't think that's great. Now, if he can stay healthy, we finally get to see like what can he actually do as the starting quarterback. And I think there's a lot of exciting things there. It's just we haven't seen it. So it's not really a knock of like, I don't think he can do this. It's just he hasn't been on the field. Now, everything that I've heard with Baron Morton is that he is the future of this offense. So to me, it really depends on who's the quarterback, because it comes down to, you always hear like if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have none. Well, I don't think that's the case here. It's just that if Shuck can't stay healthy and you do kind of what you did last year, you have the rotation of 3 quarterbacks. You just have to have one guy and hope that he stays healthy. And if that's Shuck, great. And if that's Morton, great. I think that you got to pick one of those guys. And I think they're going to be a good team, but I think next year is really where we'll kind of see Joey McGuire's guys will be mostly in the starting lineup. You won't have some of the leftovers from the previous regime, and it'll be Morton's job at quarterback. And I think that that's where we'll really see what this team is about and taking that next step. The defense to me is where it's going to, I think it's where it's going to either make or break the season, because you have guys that are going to be disruptive. You have a extremely talented secondary. You have an absolute, honestly, how is Malik Dunlap 6'3", 220 and playing cornerback? Like what? That is nuts. Like that's insane to me. I knew he was good, but I never looked at his frame, and I had to look at the roster. I honestly had to refresh it a couple of times. I'm like, there's no way. There's no way a guy that's 220 is playing cornerback. Safety maybe, but yeah. And even then, Dunlap's a great example of that. And then you look at Rayshad Williams too. There's a lot of guys in the secondary that are experienced, but like, can you take that next step? Like, can you actually be a good defense? Because you're going to face a lot of talented offenses. You face a couple different schemes with UCF coming in with Malzahn's offense. So you're going to get, it's not quite the AAC where it's like, hey, Navy triple option, have fun, but it's different. So you get a lot of different things. You also face a lot of talented offenses, and the defense has to step up. Now, losing Tyree Wilson is going to leave a dent in that defense. Like, again, it goes back to the Deuce Vaughn thing. You're doing him a disservice, and you're kind of insulting him by saying like, oh yeah, they'll be fine without him. It's like, no, like he was really good. Like, let's just leave it at that. We don't have to be negative and say this team's going to suck, but you just can't replace guys like that overnight. So I think this is going to be more of a group effort, and it just comes down to what does this defense do to step up, create turnovers, and actually make an impact for an offense that maybe is trying to figure things out at quarterback, but should also still be explosive.
The other big thing is, look, Texas Tech has 17 returning starters, or 13 returning starters. 13 returning starters from last year. The thing about returning production is it good returning production or bad returning production? Because just because it's returning production doesn't mean that it's good. This is an offensive line that was 116th in sacks allowed and 122nd in tackles for loss allowed last year. And the lack of confidence on the defense and the lack of confidence on the offensive line is why I get the dark horse stuff, and I'm all aboard Texas Tech hype train and Joey McGuire, and this program is on the rise. But like, to me, even if they win 8 games this year, like, that's still progress for Texas Tech. I'm just not sure. I'm not sure that the foundation is there for this team for them to be this is the team that if someone surprises us and goes to the Big 12 title game, it's this team. I think that in part is because we have so many questions about everybody else. Oklahoma State lost so much the transfer portal and has brought so much in from the transfer portal. A new offense, a brand new defensive coordinator for the third, a different defensive coordinator for 30 in a row. You're starting a guy at quarterback who hasn't started a game in like what feels like a decade, even though I think it was 3-4 years ago. Then you've got new teams with UCF, BYU, Houston, Cincinnati. Baylor, at this point, we've seen both the best and I think the worst sometimes from what they've got going on, and you have a new DC again. It feels like everyone else after these top 5 has so many question marks that have to be answered that it's really hard to tell, is one of these programs at their up cycle and ready to pounce and win the close games that have to be won to find a way to get to Arlington. So let me ask you this, and you can comment on that in a second. Set the top 5 aside. I know you have OSU 6, UCF 7, Kansas State, so in theory, that would be the order of next up. But do you feel like there's another team or two that we would say, this is the true, like, you just couldn't see it coming, but maybe we should have?
I mean, TCU is the perfect example. I think that you looked at TCU last year as a middle of the conference type team. It's not that they were going to be bad, but you didn't think nobody, even in TCU circle, nobody was saying, "Hey, we're going to play for national championship this year."
No,
now,
nobody
I'm sure
anywhere.
Like 1 or 2 drunk frat boys probably said something like, "Oh, we're going to win it all this year," and obviously that didn't work still. But nobody said that, and I don't think that anybody's saying. I think the 6 through 11 is that range for this new Big 12 of those teams that we're not really talking about them as contenders for the Big 12 championship, but there's things that you could see happening that would make a lot of sense. I mean, you look at TCU's formula last year. You have a new coach coming in, which is like just really hard to compare anyone else to them because that's such a unique circumstance. But you have 2 quarterbacks coming in. Duggan obviously has played and shown success. Same with Chandler Morris. We all knew who Quentin Johnston was. Most of us knew who Kendra Miller was. And then you had a couple other receivers and a tight end in Jared Wiley that you're like, yeah, they could be really good, but they're probably going to be just decent. So you have to kind of find like, who are those guys that have another level to reach, and how do they do that? Now, a team like UCF is one of those teams. I think John Rice Plumlee has another level to reach as a passer. I think that his top 2 targets in Kobe Hudson and Javon Baker have another level to reach. They have a defense that is really, really good. I think it's going to be one of the more underrated defenses in the Big 12 just because people don't know who they are, but that's a team that could make that step. Kansas is another team. I don't know if they can make it to the Big 12 championship, but we're kind of back to, I mean, it doesn't help when you finish the year that they did. But if you look at that team, we're once again kind of back at like, well, we're not kind of doubting Kansas and we don't really know what they're going to be. Jalen Daniels could be bad. Only threw for, it was like 2,014 yards last year. So you could take another step as a passer. Baylor, I don't know. Baylor's so hard because you're not sure. BYU is another team that could be sneaky good because we don't know what Keaton Slovis is going to do. He could be a lot better. I mean, at one point we were talking about him as a first-round NFL draft pick. Then now injuries and inconsistent play have plagued him since he left USC. But if he gets back on track, this is a team, along with the retooled defense, that'd be good. Iowa State is always a coin flip just because you have no idea. Like Matt Campbell does such a great job of getting his guys to compete. They don't have the talent level as some of these other teams, but if he gets it to where everybody is playing as one unit, then they're a really good team. We just don't know. We saw last year that wasn't exactly the case. They didn't have the talent. They weren't playing exactly together, and now they come back with a lot of good returning starters. They could be better too. So I think in this 6 to 11 range is where you find maybe this year's TCU, and we'll see what that means if it's a Big 12 championship game appearance or if they're just better than what people expect.
You mentioned Iowa State. I want to talk about them. 15 returning starters, a massively disappointing year where you had arguably a top 5 defense in the country. I think one could argue as good as they were, especially dealing with an offense that could do nothing. An offense who couldn't run the ball after Jabril Brock got injured, and I think that spikes a lot to Jabril Brock, who I think will be pretty good in the Big 12 this year. You lose Xavier Hutchinson, you lose Will McDonald. That's losing both of them. Those are not guys you can easily replace, and we've never really seen Iowa State be able to just have an arsenal of pass catchers at wide receiver. It's been a weakness for quite some time. You've got a new offensive coordinator, you've got a new offensive line coach. A lot of changes here. You finally bring in a special teams coordinator because no one's had worse special teams ever. Goodness, they got to get that figured out. With Iowa State, it's so hard to not feel like, was last year the bottoming out and now we're back up heading on the up cycle? Or are we still in a weird spot? Like, what is your view on Iowa State heading in this year? Because they're a team I'm having a hard time with.
Yeah, it's kind of hard when you have two games where you have 14 and 10 points and lose both of those games. Like that's your defense doing its job and the offense just nowhere to be found. And I think that yes, I think that this is a much better team than it was last year. And you mentioned, Xavier Hutchinson is gone, Will McDonald is gone, and you can lean on those guys so much, but now it kind of forces you to be more well-rounded because I don't know have the numbers in front of me, but the catch discrepancy between Xavier Hutchinson and the next closest guy was ridiculous. Like there should not be that many targets for one guy and then so few for the next closest guy. So that's going to force, the wide receivers to actually work together and be a more cohesive unit instead of just one guy's carrying us. Because honestly, Iowa State doesn't recruit where you can just have one guy carry you. Like there's not that kind of talent on this roster. This is very much Matt Campbell is going to get everybody on defense to play as one unit and everybody on offense to play as one unit. And if you have to rely on one star to do everything, they're going to have a 4-8 season. Like that's just not going to work. And that's why I think that they're going to be better this year because you have, again, I think outside of Ames, there's a lot of guys on this roster that people would be like, I have no idea who that is. Who does he play for? Like, is he in the MAC or like who are these guys? And that's honestly like that's what Iowa State needs to be. They need to be that team that everybody's like, who are these guys? Because you look at even Mike Rose, who was one of my favorite college football players of all time. Even when he was good, like he was getting maybe third team All-American preseason attention from everybody. Like, and this was dude who tackles everything. And everybody in the Big 12 knew who he was. And even some circles in the Big 12 were still just like, yeah, that dude from up north somewhere, like he's okay. And like you always discount Iowa State because they're Iowa State. And I love when they're in that underdog role because then it makes the games that much more exciting. People are kind of like dumbfounded when Iowa State is giving Oklahoma a run for the money at home or when Texas is imploding for the fifth time in a season because they can't figure out how to score any points on Iowa State's defense. And I think that also that the scheme that they run defensively is what makes it so intriguing and makes them so much better because they don't put themselves in bad situations where they need one guy to make a play. Their scheme is so sound where they just have everybody doing the right thing, and as long as everybody's playing together, they're going to be fine. So yeah, I think Iowa State is in a much better situation just because now they're forced to play together instead of like, oh well, Hutch has got us, or hey, Will's going to make a play here. You have to play for each other instead of just like, well, this guy's going to cover up any of our mistakes. You don't have that luxury this year, and that's going to make them better as a whole.
Joe, let's wrap up on this. You've got 10 players to watch on here and superlatives on the front page for the Big 12 section. And one player I notice is in both. That would be Kansas starting quarterback Jalen Daniels, both as your 10 players to watch, and you have him as basically the most underrated player in the Big 12 this year. And it does feel like we're just not talking about Jalen Daniels that much. Like I don't see a lot of people having a conversation outside of, Kansas Twitter, having a conversation about Jalen Daniels, despite what he was able to do last year. Don't let Kansas State fans hear this. They're going to get all up in arms and start talking about Will Howard stats, which fine guys, like we were wrong and he's good. But like, is Jalen Daniels the guy that we just should be talking about a whole lot more? You got him as your most underrated. So I feel like you agree that we should be.
Yes, absolutely. And then it comes down to, again, another guy that if he stays healthy, we're going to be talking about him more. I think that's just plain and simple. And I think the other thing that doesn't help is that Jason Bean is back as well, and they're going to utilize him whether Daniels is hurt or not. So that doesn't help Daniels, but I get why they use. I mean, Bean is super fast, so you got to utilize him when you can because you have that talent. It's just a matter of how do you keep Daniels in the spotlight with using a talent like Bean at the same time. So I think that at the beginning of the year, we talked about Kansas all the time because they were undefeated and they just beat Duke and they just, Jalen Daniels was playing really well. They beat Houston and Jalen Daniels looked really good. And then things obviously didn't go well after the TCU game, but then everybody kind of just like, again, this is why you need to keep everybody's attention, because people will quickly tune you out if you start losing, because we didn't talk about Jalen Daniels outside of the Big 12 and maybe even within some of the circles in the Big 12 until the bowl game against Arkansas, when it was just nobody could stop anybody. So that's where he becomes underrated, is because we don't talk about him consistently. And you're in a class that has a lot of talented quarterbacks. So that's a reason why he's underrated, is because we're going to talk about Caleb Williams and Drake May, and probably until we pull our hair out. And that's going to get really, really fun. Heavy sarcasm there. But you look at some of the guys that are really talented that we're not talking about. Jalen Daniels is one of those guys. If you watch Jalen Daniels at his peak and you come back to me and tell me that doesn't look like a fun quarterback to watch, we're not watching the same type of football. Like, he's electric with the football in his hands. He's taken a step forward as a passer, and I think he has another level to reach. So to me, he's underrated, but that's the reason why you have to watch him, is because his peak is so good and all conference for sure type skill level. And if you're not watching him, you're just missing out on what could be one of the most exciting players in this conference.
Joe, always appreciate your time. This is not going to be your last appearance on the show this summer. I promise everybody that. Do me a favor. This preview magazine is incredible. I think it's fantastic. I'm just going to be sitting here digesting as I start putting stuff together ready for the season. Where can everyone go and find it, especially since it is free?
Pretty much on any social media I have, but mostly Twitter is the one that everybody knows me from. Just find me at Joe Broback. It'll just be the pinned tweet that I have, so it should be pretty easy to find.
If you're listening to this podcast, I will have the link in the show notes so that you can go and get it for yourself. I suggest you get it, pour over it. Feel free to tweet at Joe about what you disagree with. He's happy to chat with you. Be nice, folks. Okay, we all have our opinions. It's okay. It's okay to differ. It's all right. Joe, man, I always appreciate your time. It's incredible to get you on the show. And we will talk to you again real soon, bud.
Sounds good.